This is Tromelin Island, an incredibly remote and barren place, so much so that it was once known simply as the Isle of Sand. In 1761, nearly 100 people forcibly taken from their homeland were abandoned here. Most of them would never be seen or heard from again. This is the harrowing story of their fate. On the night of July 31st, 1761, Captain Jean de Lafargue stared at two conflicting maps. He commanded a French vessel called l'Utile and was pressed for time. But with two contradictory charts of the Indian Ocean, navigating was proving difficult. After departing from Madagascar's eastern shores, Captain Jean sailed into the pitch-black night, with winds reaching up to 20 knots. Unfortunately, no map or visibility could help him realize in time that the ship was straying off course. Without a reliable chart, he was left with inaccurate information. A more cautious captain might have slowed down and waited for dawn, but Jean couldn't afford delays. His ship carried over 140 men, and he was on a mission to sail west from the Isle of France, modern-day Mauritius, to Madagascar to collect beef and rice. But unknown to anyone outside the crew, he had added a secret stop. While the official shipment would have brought in good money, Jean had planned a more profitable detour. He intended to bypass the Isle of France and head for Rodriguez Island, where a hidden cargo would be unloaded. Beneath the deck, 160 Malagasy men, women, and children, natives of Madagascar, were imprisoned, destined to be sold once the ship reached Rodriguez. Their sale promised far greater profit than the legitimate cargo. And since the governor of the Isle of France had recently outlawed such trade, the entire venture was illegal, which only added pressure on Jean's decisions. As he struggled with the navigation, the crew pressed on blindly, still unaware of the tiny island directly in their path. The real danger wasn't the island itself, but the shallow coral reef surrounding it, hidden just below the waves. Jean learned too late just how deadly it was. Violent waters slammed l'Utile into the reef, ripping open the hull and flooding the ship within minutes. Though Captain Jean and most of the crew managed to swim ashore, 18 men drowned in the chaos. Below deck, many of the enslaved Malagasy had no escape. Some survived by squeezing through gaps created by the reef's impact, but nearly half remained trapped when the ship sank. At dawn, their grim reality came into view. Over 120 crew members and 60 to 80 Malagasy people had survived, now marooned on what was then called the Isle of Sand. As the sun lit up the landscape, horror likely set in. This was one of the worst places on Earth to be stranded. Tromelin Island, first recorded by the French in the 1720s, sits roughly 300 miles from Réunion Island and 280 miles from Madagascar, isolated in the vast Indian Ocean. Once a volcanic formation, erosion and rising seas had left only a tiny fragment above water, barely a square kilometer in area, about the size of a city block. Its highest point stood just 23 feet, 7 meters, above sea level. Spotting any passing ship was next to impossible, and the name Isle of Sand was no exaggeration. There were no trees, just sand, some scattered grass, and low shrubs. Vegetation was minimal, and so were animals. Fishing was difficult because of the reef, and the only consistent food came from seabirds or turtles that occasionally arrived. Though the island had a tropical climate, the lack of shelter or shade made temperatures brutal for most of the year. In reality, July and August are the only 2 months when the average temperature dips just below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius. For the remainder of the year, the sun scorches the island, producing relentless heat. Due to its small size and exposure to natural forces, even relatively milder days are marked by strong winds. Summertime also brings frequent violent cyclones and tropical storms, which, if nothing else, result in heavy rainfall. This becomes especially critical for anyone staying on the island, since there is no fresh water source available. From the moment Captain Jean ended up stranded on the island with the other survivors, his behavior began to deteriorate. Already under immense stress from illegally smuggling the Malagasy and being marooned in the Indian Ocean, he now faced not only the loss of the large payment he expected, but also the impossibility of hiding the serious crime he had committed. If, or when, rescue came, which was far from certain, Captain Jean would have to face the governor of Isle of France. Eventually, the stress overwhelmed him entirely, and he appeared to disconnect from reality. Something within him broke, and he was never the same afterward. Because of his mental collapse, the crew had no choice but to remove him from command. Following this, First Lieutenant Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet assumed leadership and began to coordinate survival plans. In the early days after the shipwreck, crew members scavenged everything that had washed ashore, while others swam out to the wreck to retrieve remaining supplies. Thanks to their efforts, they managed to collect a decent stockpile of wood, food, and other essentials. However, one vital necessity, securing a source of drinkable water, was completely overlooked. Since the crew controlled all resources and didn't treat the Malagasy as equals, they lacked any real motivation to address the water issue early on. This neglect led to the tragic deaths of 8 Malagasy due to dehydration in the first few days. Only after these losses did the new captain order the digging of a well in search of fresh water. Even though all were enduring the same harsh conditions, the social divide between the two groups remained. They worked side by side on essential survival efforts like building a cooking oven and a forge for metalwork, but the Malagasy received little food or water. The crew even physically separated themselves by establishing camp on the opposite end of the island. But the clearest sign of inequality emerged when Barthélemy ordered the construction of a new ship using parts from l'Utile. Incredibly, the goal wasn't just to build a raft from leftover wood, but to construct a fully functional ship from scratch. When it was finished, they named it the Providence. On September 27th, nearly 2 months after the wreck, the Providence was loaded and set sail from the Isle of Sand. However, the Malagasy survivors were left behind, with only a promise that a rescue would follow. 4 days into the journey, the Providence reached Madagascar. During the voyage, an illness spread through the crew, claiming several lives, including that of Captain Jean. With Jean dead, Barthélemy had to report to the governor of Isle of France. The governor was furious and severely reprimanded him. Still, Barthélemy repeatedly requested a rescue mission to the Isle of Sand, but each time he was denied. At that time, France was deeply embroiled in the 7 Years' War with Britain, and not a single ship could be spared for a rescue. As a result, the Malagasy were left without hope. In the initial months following the Providence's departure, around 60 Malagasy survivors waited in hope for rescue. A rescue that would never arrive. Eventually, they were forced to adapt to survive in the island's harsh conditions. With scarce natural resources, they dug pits in the sand, reinforcing them with coral rock to create shelter. Tragically, when someone died, they were buried in structures similar to mausoleums seen in graveyards today. Large pits were excavated, with walls built up from the base to several feet above ground. These were then sealed with stone roofs, forming enclosed tombs meant to house the dead permanently. The Malagasy survivors essentially found themselves living among what they considered to be graves. What made matters worse was that these individuals came from Madagascar's central highlands, a region far removed from the country's coasts. They had little to no experience living near the sea or finding food from it, as their lives had been rooted inland. The scarcity of available resources made survival even more difficult. To complicate things further, one of the few available food sources, turtles, was taboo to eat in Madagascar. Yet, as hunger intensified, their hesitation quickly disappeared. Starvation left them with no choice. The only glimmer of hope was that turtles, and even fish, didn't become their main food source. Evidence suggests that while the Malagasy eventually became skilled at fishing, they primarily relied on seabirds, which were the most plentiful and accessible form of nutrition. Despite securing basic needs like food, water, and shelter early on, their population steadily declined. Whether due to illness or malnutrition is unclear, but gradually, people began to die. Shortly after the ship's crew abandoned the island, the remaining Malagasy built a large raft using whatever wood was left. 18 people boarded it, hoping to find help for those left behind. Tragically, they were never seen again. As time dragged on, days turned into months, and months into years. Stranded on a barren island, hope dwindled. After 3 years, only 15 of the original 60 remained alive. A year after the Providence arrived in Madagascar, Barthélemy returned to France. But to his credit, he continued to plead for a rescue mission. Despite repeated refusals from the governor, he pressed onward, appealing to anyone with political influence. His relentless efforts eventually reached the Minister of Marine Affairs in the Isle of France. In 1772, 11 years after the shipwreck and with the war over, Barthélemy's persistence paid off. Approval was finally granted for a rescue mission. However, bureaucracy delayed action, and 3 more years passed before a ship departed. Even a reported sighting of the survivors in 1773 and appeals in the French press didn't speed up the mission. At last, in 1775, the first rescue ship set sail, but it stopped at the reef's edge and turned back. Another year passed before a second attempt was made. This time, the ship anchored near the reef and sent a rowboat. But just before it launched, a storm hit. The rowboat was overwhelmed by waves and broke apart, throwing both sailors into the sea. One swam back to the ship, the other reached shore, only to watch helplessly as the ship sailed away. This abandoned sailor joined the surviving Malagasy and later led another raft-building effort. Unlike the previous one, this raft had a sail made from seabird feathers. The sailor and 6 Malagasy set out into the Indian Ocean, but they too were never seen again. The remaining survivors returned to their isolated existence, clinging to the hope that help might still arrive. But as more time passed, they slowly came to terms with the reality. No one was coming. Each failed rescue must have deepened their despair, turning renewed hope into bitter disappointment. Eventually, they likely grew numb, accepting that they'd been left behind and had to continue their fragile existence alone. All of that changed on November 29, 1776. On that very day, a small French warship named the Dauphin reached the island under the leadership of Captain Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tromelin. What he and his crew witnessed was astonishing. Of the 60 to 80 Malagasy who had survived the shipwreck, only 7 women remained. One of them cradled an 8-month-old baby born on the island, while the others wore garments crafted from woven seabird feathers. Captain Jacques examined the living conditions of the Malagasy and found them almost unbelievable. Small shelters stood grouped together, and a shed constructed from coral stones had been built to store food supplies. Remarkably, the Malagasy had even erected a small watchtower to keep an eye out for passing ships. After years of struggle, their ordeal was finally over. When Captain Jacques brought the women and the infant aboard, and the Dauphin sailed away from the island, it marked the first time in 15 years that the Malagasy had left the Isle of Sand. The women were taken to the Isle of France, where the new governor received them with warmth. He granted them their freedom and arranged for their return to Madagascar. However, the women declined the offer. Whether it was due to fear of another shipwreck or some other reason remains unknown, but the governor respected their wishes and instead granted them citizenship on the Isle of France. The baby, along with his mother and grandmother, was later welcomed into the governor's household, where they lived on his estate. He gave each of them new names and had them baptized, integrating them into his family. As the other survivors settled on the Isle of France, their story gradually faded into obscurity. In honor of Captain Jacques' successful rescue mission, the Isle of Sand was renamed Tromelin Island, a name it still bears. Located in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the island, because of its tragic past, has become a site of archaeological interest. Since 2006, 4 archaeological expeditions have been conducted to uncover how the Malagasy endured for 15 years on such a desolate island. The first expedition recorded the remaining wreckage of the ship. By then, only immovable items such as anchors, cannons, ammunition, and rigging were left behind. The Malagasy had utilized every resource available to them for survival. The subsequent expedition concentrated on uncovering artifacts and human remains from those who perished on the island. Archaeologists discovered 3 of the structures the survivors had built, including one believed to be a kitchen. Inside, they found the original oven used when they were first stranded, along with a pile of copper bowls salvaged from the ship. These bowls bore clear signs of use and repair, an extraordinary accomplishment given their limited tools. To fix the bowls, the Malagasy had repurposed copper from the wreckage, melting and reshaping it into patches and creating rivets from rolled copper sheets, using bone and metal tools to drill holes. Among the findings were handmade spoons and an iron tripod designed for cooking over open flames. A large lead bowl was also discovered, suggesting that the survivors may have suffered from lead poisoning later on. In addition to cooking tools, archaeologists unearthed pieces of copper jewelry, rings, necklaces, and bracelets, as well as a copper comb used for grooming. These seemingly minor items provided compelling evidence that the Malagasy had established a functioning community on the barren island, managing to survive in extraordinarily harsh conditions. As for the specifics of the 15 years the Malagasy spent on Tromelin Island, much remains unknown. Although survivors were interviewed, no written records of their first-hand accounts have ever been recovered. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, we invite you to explore our other videos on historic expeditions. Have a story idea? Submit it using the form in the description. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.